So if you're new to this format, you probably spelled it wrong. So welcome to the Science of. I am Scientist Mel, and if you're new to this format, essentially what I do is I have various topics that are suggested by people, and then I put it up to a vote, and whichever topic wins, that's what I talk about every Saturday. And so this particular topic is kind of close to my heart because I'm a woman that's in STEM. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what the history of women in STEM. Now it's very broad, so I'm going to be kind of crunching it down a little bit, just hitting main points and highlights and things that we've got going on and things that we can do to, you know, make it better. So let's talk a little bit about women in STEM. So over here, we have a little bit of a brief history in regards to it. In 1636, now this is not the first university. I'm using Harvard as an example, and the examples I'm using are going to be U.S. based. Again, because this is a broad area, so I'm kind of narrowing it down to, you know, knowledge and that I would have, and also statistics that I have access to. So in 1636, Harvard opens. In 1879, they found a school that's for women, and it's separate. But the thing is women weren't allowed to take certain courses. They felt that there were certain courses that were primarily for men. Now, in 1879, women petitioned for the law school to take women there, and they wouldn't allow women into graduate classes involving Harvard. So in 1920, the graduate school allowed women in the education department. In 1945, they allowed women in medical school, and it wasn't until 1950 that women were allowed in law school. Now, around in 1833, there were women that were allowed at university in Oberlin. But again, only certain classes. So any classes that were STEM as primarily male-oriented, including sciences and math, those were reserved for men. Now, it wasn't until about 1980 that we see a 50% attendance for both men and women. So I'm only touching on a little brief bit of history here. So let's take a look at this. So in the sciences and in the math, STEM has primarily been male dominated, and this is largely due to some societal constraints at the time. Women thought that they were incapable. They didn't, some of them didn't think that they could do math or science because that's primarily what men do. Women, and men felt women were incapable. They thought, well, this isn't, you know, this isn't women's work. You know, this is too hard for them. They're not gonna, their brains are different, you know, they're not the same, which we know now is very, very different. Women and men don't really have any differences in capabilities. But at the time, women were primarily meant for marriage and for babies. So if you did go to university, it was to find a really hot, you know, dude that's smart and could like supply money so you could stay home. So that's kind of where they were going with that. So there's a lot of different societal constraints at the time. So let's talk a little bit about some women in history as far as in STEM. We're still kind of going through a bit of this history. This is probably one of the most famous examples of what happens to a woman, especially in the past, in dealing with a male-dominated field, molecular biology. It's Rosalind Franklin. So women have been in science. You can Google countless stories of women who have contributed hugely to our understanding of the stars, astronomy, all kinds of different fields. They worked under men, and men got the credit. Their voices have not been as loud, and their work has been stolen, and they've been snubbed by Nobel Prize for Nobel Prizes, and, you know, due to sexism. And Rosalind Franklin, it's her work, technically speaking, that led Watson and Crick to develop the helical structure of DNA. This is the most known case. So let's talk about a few cases that were less known. Now, I may say her name wrong, and if I do, I'm very sorry. I'm not very good with that, and so that's my fault. Marie Curie gave her life for her discovery. Yes, she did. She was the first one to win a Nobel Prize, and she was a woman who won 2 for her work. Chen-Xing Wu. She worked in the Manhattan Project, and she also worked with cobalt-60, a radioactive type of metal. Her work upended the law of parity. At the time, quantum mechanics felt that there were 2 physical systems like atoms that were mirror image and they would behave in identical ways. Her work upended that entire law and disproved it. It changed the way that they look at physical chemistry. But she didn't get the Nobel Prize. Her colleagues did, and they left her out. There was some outcries about this, but the fact remains, she wasn't taken seriously, and it was her work that was crucial to upending this law of parity and changing the way that we do quantum mechanics, but they left her out. Her colleagues got all the credit for that. Here's another example. Esther Lederberg. She discovered the lambda bacteriophage. Now, why that's important is she's the one who found that viruses can actually infect bacteria. And that's one way that we're able to understand certain types of diseases where you have bacteria that's normally harmless that becomes harmful, especially in water supplies. We can see this type of thing going on with that. Now, she also worked with her husband in working on F fertility factor and replica plating. Her husband got the Nobel Prize. He left her out and shared it with his colleagues. So her husband is the one who got credit for a lot of work, and he did do some work, but a lot of her contributions helped him helped him with the replica plating, and she should have gotten far more credit with the lambda bacteriophage, which she didn't. Here's another lady, Jocelyn Burnell. She discovered pulsars while she was still a graduate student in 1967. She worked in radio astronomy at the Cambridge University in England. Her supervisor and a colleague got the Nobel, and they left her out. But it was her discovery of pulsars. She's the one who discovered it, not her supervisor. But he's the one that got the credit for it. And like I said, sometimes you see a bit of an outcry on this, but they don't know it. That people don't, in the past, this was just 1967. This wasn't 100 years ago. This is within people's lifetimes that we've had this happen. So let's talk a little bit about statistics. So I've been combing through and I've been doing a lot of research because I know that there's a lot of back and forth in regards to what do we know. So the statistics that I'm going to present to you, they're part of an organization that's working to help understand women in STEM, and I can give you those links. I have all of my sources at the end of this presentation, and I'll be happy to link you to them at the end of our little talk. So the current school statistics, this goes to, I believe, 2016, possibly 2015. But on K through 12, that's kindergarten through 12th grade, girls are on par with their male peers in regards to achievement in mathematics and science. Now, there are gaps that have been found in race, background, and income. And they do find that less educated parents and families that have lower incomes tend to have students that have less enrollment in regards to the harder science classes, the AP classes, the college prep classes. There's less enrollment in that, and they're finding a link between less educated parents and also low income. Now, they are finding a trend that male students in K through 12 tend to take more engineering and computer science classes. I'm going to touch on a little bit of how that affects us later on in other statistics, and we can find them right here. So let's talk about university. Women are taking science classes. They're getting involved in the sciences and the maths in the STEM-based coursework. But and we see it with 50% of graduates are women in science and engineering degrees. But we still see a disparity involving gender, especially with minority women. So only 11.2% of science and engineering degrees are women of color. We don't see so much representation of them in this field. 8.2% of graduate degrees in regards to STEM are women of color, and even less, 4.1%, are doctoral candidates. So we don't see a very good representation of women of color in regards to the STEM fields. Now, when we're talking about gender disparity in specific sciences, now we may say, okay, 50% of science and engineering degrees are women. Well, let's break that down. Only 17.9% of computer science graduates are women, 19.3% engineering, 39% physical sciences, and about 43.1% mathematics. So we do have a higher number in the physical and mathematical sciences, but it's extremely low in regards to computer science and engineering. Let's look at how this translates. These are a lot of numbers, so I don't expect you to look at everything. I just wanted to just kind of throw some numbers out there. So we do have, as far as in the STEM workplace, 50% of college-educated workforce is basically women, which is good, but only 29% is science and engineering. So that means 29% of STEM jobs are women. Primarily, we see them mostly in the social sciences and biology sciences. We don't see them so much in the computer or the math sciences. Now, if we're going to break it down, 35% of chemists are women, 11% are physicists or astronomers, 33% are chemical or environmental engineers. That's why you don't see many female engineers at Microsoft. You don't. They don't get involved in the field. They're not taking the classes. They're not getting the degrees, and then they don't get the jobs. Only 17% are architectural or civil engineers. 17% are industrial engineers. 10% of the workforce is electrical or computer hardware engineers, and even less are mechanical engineers. We just don't see hardly any women in engineering. So let's talk a bit about our women of color. So race and ethnicity. So race and ethnicity are salient factors in regards to this. So the U.S. science and engineering workforce has become more diverse, but several racial ethnic minority groups continue to be significantly underrepresented. So in 2013, 70% of STEM workers were white. And only 11% out of 27% U.S. working age population. You know, you're counting 27% of the population being working minorities. Only 11% of STEM work in general was women of color. So minority women make up 1 out of 10 employees when it comes to scientists and engineers. They are vastly underrepresented in these fields. So let's talk about why. Let's talk about the current issues. We know that women are going to college. We know they're getting degrees, and we know that some of them are getting jobs. But why are they still underrepresented? There's current issues for this. A lot of them are leaving the field, and there's many reasons that could be contributing to this. Largely sexism, harassment. A lot of them aren't first authors. There are recent studies to show that the number of first authors on papers that are women have dropped dramatically. There's a lack of women representation in peer review. There's a recent study that's come out about that. Because there's fewer women in peer review, there's fewer papers that have first author females or women actually being published. And so you have a lot of issues in regards to that. And also, treatment by their peers plays a role in whether or not women will stay in a particular field. Let's look at some statistics here. I'm going to switch over to this. Let's switch over so you can see a bit better. Here we go. I have a chart here, and this is from the American Association of the University Women. And they did a study to kind of look at why are there so few women in engineering and computing, because that is a real issue we saw with numbers that were reported from various other reputable sources. We see that we have an extensive drop between 1990 to 2013 in computer and mathematical occupations, but we see a marginal rise from 9% to 12% with engineers. Now, we do have an increase of biological scientists as well as chemists and material scientists in regards to women, but there's a massive drop involving computer science as well as engineering. So, let's look at a study that they worked with involving choosing the right candidate. Now, it shows here that 69%, there's a good chance that they're going to choose when a person is a hiring individual that's trying to bring in engineers and scientists. There's a 69% chance that they are going to pick a higher performing male or female. Gender, irregardless, it doesn't matter. Gender doesn't matter in that case. 69% chance you're going to do that. There's a 29% chance that they'll pick a lower performing male. That's still kind of high, but only a 2% chance that they're going to pick a lower performing female. So men that have less ability have a better chance at getting a job than a woman who has less ability. Okay? Let's look at this next one here. How employers rate male and female candidates with identical resumes. They tend to favor males. So even if there's equal contributions, and I believe this was a study that's based on 2015. So even if there's equal contributions, they look at competence, higher ability, and mentoring, they still favor men over women. So a bias is there. And we all have bias, and it's all a part of us. Even as a former educator, I had to take classes to ensure that I even wrote test questions and had a solid rubric to where I was looking for specific things. So even my own personal bias that I may not even realize I have wouldn't bleed through when I'm grading papers. So everybody has bias, and so it's important that we acknowledge this. So people who hire have bias. So let's take a look at this. Why do women leave engineering fields? So job satisfaction of women engineers in the workforce. So we have engineers with low job satisfaction and engineers with high job satisfaction. So this is based on women who are equally capable. They found that women who observed sexist behavior had lower job satisfaction than those who had high job satisfaction. Same with experienced undermining behaviors by the supervisor or experienced undermining behaviors by coworkers. So women are still being subjected to undermining, sexist behavior, harassment. All of these different things are likely contributing to them leaving the field. The work environment, bias, and sexism. So these are all things that need to be addressed. So let's talk about some of these recent studies. There are so many studies that have been done to try to figure out what is going on, because we know both males and females can perform well. Sadly, a lot of your fellow male engineers at Microsoft discriminate against women engineers. They do. I mean, it's a thing, and it happens. And it doesn't just translate to the job force, and they're judged more harshly, and we see that not just in engineering fields, but we see that in the media as well with news anchors. We see that with the current administration. And it's a behavior that's kind of ingrained. And so what they're finding out, especially with a lot of studies that they've been doing, they did a study just looking at male classmates in undergrad biology classes, all right, because we know that there's a good representation of men and women in biology fields, about 50% almost, okay, so there's a fairly decent representation of women in regards to that, but they found that male classmates consider other males more apt in science than women, even if women do show that they're better than a particular male classmate. Male classmates will still say, this guy is better at science than this woman. I mean, and you would think this sounds absolutely ridiculous. This shouldn't be happening, but it does happen. And it's likely not isolated just to biology. You worked in government with a very capable woman engineer, saw her undermined, and she left. So that's the thing. Women want to do what they love, which is fantastic. But if they're subjected to a hostile work environment, why in the world would they want to stay in that? There's no job security in that regard, and you're going to just get passed over constantly in promotions to less, to lesser performing individuals. So the treatment of women in these fields likely contribute to them leaving it. So if male classmates in biology classes think men are better than women in science, even though they show that they're not in these particular cases, that's going to translate also to people who hire and supervisors. So it would be kind of foolish to assume that this is just isolated to one particular field, but that was the group that they studied. There's also evidence to show that women are kind of forced to choose family over career. So traditionally, men have been scientists, and they've had spouses who have been at home with the children, and so they haven't had to worry so much about who's going to take care of the kids. Now, women who are scientists tend to be married to other scientists. And so since they tend to be married to other scientists, when it comes time to have babies, you're looking at a couple of scientists who are married. They usually say, okay, well, she can stay home. She can stay home. Which one of you is going to give up your career in order to take care of the children? So that shouldn't be the case, but there's evidence to show that that is largely part of it. And so also, an inappropriate work environment. You can find countless stories of women who were in graduate school who were subjected to sexism and harassment. You can also see stories like this where they overhear people, making sexist jokes or making jokes about the human, female anatomy and rape jokes and things like that. They make an inappropriate work environment that makes women feel uncomfortable. Now, there's evidence for this. Now, I know I got into a bit of a Twitter back and forth with somebody who felt like there was no systematic racism or sexism. Well, if that's the case, why don't we have more representation of women of color in STEM? Why don't we have more representation of women in computer engineering? I mean, it can't just be women just choose to not get involved in computers. I'm a gamer. I love video games. I think it'd be awesome to make video games. But given all of the things that we're hearing about what's going on in their hostile work environment, that's possibly part of the reason why we don't see so many women in that field. But that's why we need more research in order to definitively say, okay, this is a problem. So, what are we going to do with that? We need to learn more. We need to talk about things, and we need to make things, while a lot of these topics aren't necessarily comfortable and they don't make people happy and it's icky to talk about, it's still important that it's openly discussed and addressed and say, hey, look, This is what's happening. We can either, instead of sitting here and saying, oh, it's not real, we need to say, okay, why are your hiring policies like this? Why are your laboratories set up this way? Why do you have this issue going on here? It's important to address the individual issues that are contributing to a systematic problem. So let's conclude here. So here's my set of conclusions. Women have struggled to be accurately represented in science. I mean, this is something that's true, and it's there. And you can Google just about any story. And I have links on another slide I'll show you in a second. They're underrepresented. They have made huge contributions, and there's still lots of walls for us to overcome. But we have to start shifting perception and perspectives towards how can we fix this rather than pretending it doesn't exist. We need to address bias, because that's what scientists do. Our whole job is to stop and say, hey, we got bias on this. We need to address our own personal bias, and we need to address these hostile work environments that women are, subjected to. We also have to understand progress isn't a straight line, and I get that. It's really not. But the more that we do to work towards progress, the better it's going to be. So I'm going to show you all of my sources here. And I know this is a lot here, but the Smithsonian magazine site is fantastic. It has a list of historic females you may not have heard of. Former President Obama had a whole initiative of discussing lesser known women in science, and I can shoot you those links. There's biology students that consistently underestimate female peers. There's a study for that. The NWHM.org talks about women in education. U.S. News has some first in women's education in the United States. Harvard University, hard-earned gains for women. They have a whole exhibit just on what women have had to go through at Harvard. News.nationalgeographic.com. That's a great article on women scientists who are overlooked. The NGC Project. That is where I've gotten a lot of my statistics. TheGuardian.com had a really good article about industry sexist constructs. And then the American Association of University Women, they have their studies that they've done there. So I want to take a minute to thank my patrons whenever this comes up here. It looks like I did not mean to pull that up. I wanted to switch slides. Welcome to my world. There we go. I clicked on a link and it opened it up in another window. Such is my life. So I want to thank my patrons on Patreon. I want to thank Tony. I have an anonymous patron who wants to stay that way. Jen, Carl, Anthony, Patrick, and I have Tony Squared. I am updating the site today with new artwork for my patrons who contribute there. This gives me an opportunity to spend more time working on communicating with the public and generating original content in order for people to use in their classrooms and in universities. So that has been the Science of Women in STEM. So I want to thank you for stopping by. If you want to talk to me at any time, I have lots of places you can go. I'm currently building my website, scientistmel.com, and I'm still working on getting a podcast together. So you can take me with you and we can talk science in your ears. A little bit of science oral. So you can find me Scientist Mel everywhere, except for YouTube. I'm Science Email because somebody took Scientist Mel already. But I hope you've enjoyed that, and I've loved doing this. And if you have any questions, hit me up there. Thank you. Fight on. We're gonna get this done. We're gonna get some women in papers, and we're gonna be talking stuff and the sciencey things. And don't discourage youngins. I will say as an aside, when I was 12 years old, I had an English teacher who told me I would be too stupid to be a nurse, that I shouldn't be a nurse, and here I am 4 degrees later. I don't know where that lady is, but I'd really like to walk up to her and show her, you thought I was too stupid, and you said this in front of my mother and other parents. So that was nice, wasn't it? So, that'll stick with a person. Encourage people, and encourage boys and girls and men and women to respect each other. Kindness is free, isn't it? So if you have any questions, hit me up, twitter.com/scientistmel. And thank you for being here. I hope you guys have an awesome day. Thank you so much. Bye.